Boa noite a todos que nos assistem e aos que assistirão, pois a live fica gravada. Estamos começando a oitava e última live do Ciclo de Eventos 2026.1, promovido pelo Letrare, Laboratório de Edição, Tradução e Revisão de Textos Acadêmicos, e pela Projeto, a pós-graduação em Estudos da Tradução, da UFC, visando dar visibilidade às ações e pesquisas desenvolvidas no âmbito dos estudos da tradução.
Boa noite a todos. Nós estamos hoje chegando ao encerramento de mais um ciclo de eventos do Letrare, com o tema tradução, saberes, fazeres e desafios. E ao longo desse semestre a gente teve a oportunidade de reunir docentes, pesquisadores, egressos e discentes da Projeto em torno de discussões que evidenciam a atividade tradutória e a diversidade dos estudos da tradução. Então, é uma alegria concluir esse percurso com uma mesa tão especial e rica como nós temos hoje. E, de antemão, já antecipo a todos vocês que a nossa programação 2026.2 já está sendo montada, então aguardem a divulgação, que em breve nós vamos compartilhar com todos vocês e teremos grandes nomes aí no nosso segundo semestre aqui do Ciclo de Eventos.
Gostaria de pedir que vocês se inscrevam no canal, deem like no vídeo. Quando vocês fazem isso, o YouTube entende que esse vídeo é relevante e passa a recomendá-lo para mais pessoas. Por favor, também sigam o @Projeto Letrare no Instagram. Isso aumenta o alcance do projeto na plataforma e potencializa o nosso trabalho de divulgação científica. No final da live, será disponibilizado um link para o formulário de presença para que vocês possam receber o certificado de 2 horas complementares. Meu nome é Montiele Gomes, sou mestranda da Projeto na UFC e serei a host dessa live.
E eu sou a Ellen Cristiane, doutoranda também aqui da Projeto na UFC e juntamente com a Montiele, integrante da comissão organizadora do Ciclo de Eventos Letrare.
E agora vamos ao que interessa. Comigo está o professor Lambert e sua entrevistadora Adriane Moura. É uma grande honra receber os convidados desta noite. A entrevista será conduzida pela Adriane Moura, ela que é doutoranda em Estudos da Tradução pelo Programa de Pós-Graduação em Estudos da Tradução da Universidade Federal do Ceará, a Projeto na UFC, mestre em Estudos da Tradução pela mesma instituição e especialista em Direito e Processo do Trabalho pela Unicristos. Agora sobre o professor Lambert, que é muito conhecido. O professor Dr. José Cyriel Gerard Lambert é professor da Projeto na UFC e reconhecido internacionalmente por suas contribuições à consolidação dos estudos da tradução como disciplina autônoma. Participou ativamente do movimento fundador da área, ao lado de nomes como James Holmes e Gideon Torrey, tendo contribuído para os estudos descritivos da tradução. Foi organizador do histórico Simpósio de Leuven, em 1976, e teve o papel central na criação e no fortalecimento de instituições como o CETRA e a European Society for Translation Studies, EST. A internacionalização dos estudos da tradução em diversos países. Compõe também esta mesa o professor Dr. Walter Carlos Costa, pesquisador de referência nos estudos da tradução e docente da PGET, na Federal de Santa Catarina, e da Projeto na UFC. E a professora doutora Diana Fortier, professora da Projeto na UFC e coordenadora do Projeto Letrare. É uma grande satisfação recebê-los em nosso ciclo de eventos. Gostaria de agradecer por vocês terem aceitado o convite e estarem aqui hoje dispostos a compartilhar tanto conhecimento. Informamos que a entrevista será conduzida em inglês. Para aqueles que desejarem acompanhar em português, sugerimos ativar as legendas automáticas do YouTube e selecionar a opção de tradução automática para o português. Ao final, abriremos para as perguntas do público presente. Gostaríamos de reforçar que vocês podem enviar perguntas em português ou em inglês pelo chat. A nossa equipe fará a mediação e, quando necessário, a tradução das perguntas para o inglês. From this moment on, the interview will be conducted in English. We warmly welcome Professor Lambert and thank all participants for joining us today. Now, Adriane Moura. You can start the interview.
Yeah. So I am supposed to start my explanation. Is that correct? Or do you first have a question? And do we start every section? We have different questions and sections. So I guess that for the audience, it may be useful to start by asking one of the key questions. If not, I can read the question and then tackle it. Yeah. One little correction. If during the discussion your people would prefer making use of Portuguese, I guess I can manage. It's just my own discourse that is not good enough for making use of Portuguese. Okay, is Adriane starting by asking the questions, or do I start by dealing with the question as I have written it down here together with Adriane?
Adriane, can you hear?
Adriane, can you hear us?
So I think we have some technical problems with Adriane.
Hello, Adriane, do you hear me? I tried to read the expression on your face, and I have the impression that something is wrong with the technology.
I think she's got a problem.
And of course, you can join her and solve the problem immediately.
I sent her a message, but she didn't reply. She didn't reply.
In the worst case, no disaster, no problem. I read the questions, shorten them a little bit, and I give the answer. The answer as I see it in several moments. I can shorten the answers. I receive a message, it may be from Adriane, but I'll check.
I can read it as well, José.
Yeah.
If you prefer, I can read the question.
Yeah, well, if you can, please read the question, yeah?
The first one. In our contemporary world, the position of English as the main lingua franca on the planet is widely acknowledged. Important works, theories, translation training institutes have spread out in most continents. Should we assume that Brazil and Latin America has imported its approaches to the translation and interpretation phenomenon? Of course, but where from? Is all this part of the Western colonization phenomenon?
Okay. Well, I had that question, so in my notes as the last one, but there's no problem. I'll start by that. The use of a lingua franca is more or less imposed by international scholarship. How could we have scholarship with international partners without using a given lingua franca. Now, this is part of history, but in our recent world, one of the various lingua francas has taken over, I would say, the function that several lingua francas were fulfilling, to the point that maybe there's, as I call them, according to the quotes that I read in newspapers and so on in my country, it becomes like a danger, a danger for society. Universities are responsible for the internationalization of languages to a certain extent. In my country, this was very clear. It's very different in Brazil. And this is a question for society, but for scholarship, especially in the area of translation studies, this looks like, I would say, compromising. So we are obliged to use international languages, but the information about the discipline and about our discussions, the channels we use for the discussions, are a little bit too heavily indebted to translations. And so the discussion on translation worldwide is taking place to a large extent in a translated language, and not only in English. Now, the whole question is, I would say, a world problem has become a world problem. And the world problem is not only the world problem for scholarship, but also for societies. And in my country, there are discussions nowadays. I'm producing an article on such matters, because in my country, which is a small country, many intellectuals are frightened by the idea that once again in history, a foreign language will, I would say, asphyxiate our national language. Now, this shows that there is an antagonism between universities and societies. I would join one of our diplomats who says, but universities are allowed to use international languages, or in this case, English. Why would we have universities if they would not be responsible for their interaction with, I would say, the whole world? Now, very often scholars, like people in society, are convinced that nowadays there's no real problem because everyone understands English. But where English is used as a lingua franca, the translation is taking place also. This implies also that the information within a scholarly discipline that is linked fundamentally with communication, that this communication is, I would say, reduced and standardized in an extreme form, and we can hardly imagine what the consequences are. One might say that one of the first problems for research in translation studies is to study the impact of translation on the discipline and on the research. There's a lot more to be told about this, but university, we can spell it like universe dash city. There's no university if there's no ambition to go for, I would say, for globalizing insights about given topics. And we all know that many units in international teaching and education are, I would say, in small characters, cities, if not villages, that are not able to communicate with the international world. So the problem of the lingua franca is the problem of scholarship in general, and we need to have better work on this. The research in that area, it's not non-existent, but the research in that area is very weak. Now, I would even finish, that's my real answer, I would even finish by saying that this is not simply a cultural problem nor a scholarly problem, it's really a political problem. And this has been heavily underestimated. And I would even say that universities are guilty because universities believe that the question of language and translation is part of the problem of certain disciplines and not of the other ones. But without translation, medicine or engineering and so on cannot function. And I do not know if some among you would have seen Donald Trump visiting his counterparts in China. And you may have seen that these giants, they are at least 2 times as big and as strong as I am, but behind them there were 2 little persons, a lady and a gentleman. They could not talk to each other without translation. So our world is in the hands of people who cannot talk directly to each other. And I have met interpreters and translators who work, for instance, not only for, say, the United States, but I have met one of the interpreters of the Kremlin, their translator for German, who learned on his own Dutch. That's why he came to my university and he has given a class in Dutch to my students, and it was good Dutch. But he explained a few things from their everyday life that were fascinating. For instance, it is known among interpreters that the Russian interpreters had given moments in the parties that are offered to them not in the White House, but in the private houses of the various presidents. Of course, one of the first things that they are offered is whiskey and so on. And sometimes they are not able to talk too well at the end, and maybe that's one of the intentions. And very often these people have been, I would say, watched and even saved from serious blames by their interpreters. So interpreters play a role in all areas of society. And someone among you just told that she studies translation in the classroom. Well, that's part of the widening of the topic of research in translation. If you have any further questions at this moment, you're welcome, no problem.
Okay, so we can ask the second question for you.
Definitely, yes.
Okay, so and we would like to ask you about the tradition in the scholar bibliography. No need to stress that the well-known globalization trend tend to compromise our canonized bibliography on translator studies, which is obviously too Western, whatever this may mean. The problem is not the answer, yes or no, but how. And Latin America seems to be part of this new world. How can translator studies be globalized? How will translator studies be globalized?
Okay, thank you. Just one moment. I belong to a country where the French language was always dominating. I'm a Dutch-speaking Belgian citizen. We all know how narrowly information channels are, even when they are available in more than one language, they are reduced for practical and pragmatic reasons to some among them. A good example, and you can multiply examples of a similar kind, and there are various families. And that a good example is United Nations assemblies. There's an interesting discussion going on between the so-called experts from the United Nations, UNESCO, and so on the one hand, and on the other hand, the European Union. Sorry. The European Union did not go for one language. They tried to respect the language of every one of the countries. Now, this looks, say, more democratic and maybe also more reliable in terms of honest discourse and even in terms of scholarly discourse. But in fact, none of these options is a perfect option. So the people who run societies also run the use and the selection of languages. In my country, the full country changed. The federalization of government, the multiplication of government started after May 1968, because the dominant university in the country was divided into two parts. And from then on, the Flemish part of that university was very influential nationally and internationally. But this new university, created in 68, more or less, this new university decided to go for English as the international language. Until that moment, the international language of universities in Western Europe and certainly in Belgium was French. One of the consequences is a full change of bilingualism and multilingualism and knowledge of languages, language competence in the Flemish part of the country and so on. So the decisions about the channels used, even the political ones, have an enormous impact on, say, on scholarship. And one can see very well, one of the big minds in translation studies, I'll mention his name several times, is Anthony Pym. Anthony Pym tells always something when he starts with discussions on translation studies. The first thing he tells is translation studies as an academic discipline, important correction, has been created and developed and disseminated by a few small countries. Almost everyone forgets about it. It has been distributed in English by these people from Israel, from Holland, from Flanders, and so on. Not many more, but little by little there was kind of a struggle between the publishing centers, the publication centers, the publishing houses, and so on, which implies that, say, the Chinese scholars, the Indian scholars, Asia in general makes use of English sources. Now I know very well what kind of things they have borrowed from, say, from other countries where they use their own language and what kind of things they do not know. I give one example. maybe you know, some among you know the book by Edwin Gensler. I mentioned his name in the text. Edwin Gensler was one of our students at Cetra. That's not the problem. But he published a book, Translation and Identity in the Americas. Now, the title shows that for him, America is one unit. You can apply this also to Latin America, but it's difficult to speak about the Americas when you join Latin America and the many languages there with Northern America. Now, the problem is also, and this is told several times in the book by Gensler, the United States are certainly not the most developed country in terms of translation studies. The northern neighbor country in Canada is much more advanced in general. There are good centers, and of course, the the USA university is wonderful, is impressive, at least for the best ones. But translation studies is not, I would say, their strong point. Now, Gensler tries to show how things that he observes in the USA may also apply to translation studies in Latin America. Why not? And very often this is relevant, but it's clear that Latin America has quite a different culture in terms of languages, and then more specialized in terms of translation. And after all, quite a lot from your publications that you read used to come from the Western world that we call, that we refer to as Europe. And the United States knew much less about translation than Canada. Now, there are interesting things in that, and it leads us also to another point that will come up, I'm sure, in our questions. That is the fact that we are accustomed to deal with translation more and more, maybe, in terms of national institutions. And the institutionalization of language is a very important point. But not only countries nationalize or standardize languages. So there is a struggle about the channels that are used. And believe me, this is also a matter of much money. And the whole question of translation, as dealt with in universities, is also to a large extent a question of big money. Because translation studies started mainly on the basis of people. You know them, and you know some among them, and I have seen them starting them, and I belong to them. These people come from the linguistic departments, from the literary departments, which implies that very often they reduce their object of study to topics that belong to their previous disciplines. Now there is so much more to be done in terms of communication on the world level. We were very happy when at a given moment Spain developed very strongly, and they continue translation studies within sociology. And Anthony Pym, that I have mentioned, is, I would say, a very refreshing colleague among the big minds in translation studies. He is a sociologist. So channels, it's not only a matter of language, it's a matter of tradition, it's a matter of power. To give one example from the political world, I did not hear, I'm rather interested in the things that Trump says, because you can have some fun and so on. But Trump is not dealing with language as far as I know. But in Ukraine, Putin imposes Russian on the Ukrainian territories where the Russians have occupied people and country. So it's not only since Louis XIV, not even since the Greeks or the Romans. So the language policy is in the hands of people who have the resources and the means. And one of the problems in the development of translation studies, to reduce our scope to that, one of the problems is that power, but we are responsible also for that power game. And the scholars in translation studies do not insist enough on the question of language, discourse, translation in everyday life and in everyday institutionalized life, business questions. I can't say much about business questions and translation, but in this book, one of the leading books in international business, the second chapter deals with translation. And I know how this comes. It's due to scholarly channels, and it leads to, well, it even leads to CETRA and to my university, also other people than CETRA, excellent people from psychology, social psychology, economics, and so on. So we need interdisciplinarity. If we do not support that, translation studies will probably be a victim of the business orientedness of universities in the age of artificial intelligence. But that's, well, I'm going far beyond our present day situation.
Okay, the next question is, when James Holmes and the group around him started the promotion of translation studies as an academic discipline, the so-called landscape of translation studies was already quite complex, but obviously not within universities. This happened a long time ago. Would this landscape have been submitted to fundamental changes?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I hope you see some pictures, but almost the full world illustrates this. Now, of course, it's leading back into several questions that we have discussed already. But I could summarize in a few sentences the distribution of scholarly research within universities on translation. It's not fully correct to say that research on translation started outside of university, not at all. It started in translation schools, it started in machine translation and so on. What James Holmes promoted, and he was successful, and he did not keep in touch with the people he did so, that did so after 1982-83. So there was a development of people from other countries and other centers. And it was a paradox that the conference at Leuven, which was the real beginning, with a group of 7 or 8 people as a committee, Holmes was the impresario, say, but for a few years. So his basic article has been published in 72. And in 76, he organized that conference. Well, I can't tell, I'm still I'm more proud than then. I was the main organizer of the conference at Leuven that had been prepared in several centers, but with something like an organizing committee. And the problem was that after 76, there were 2 new conferences with the same people, but I would say the motivation and the united feelings in the group were weakening, and it was difficult to continue. Among the questions that were recommended, the recommendations to scholars, there was not only the fact that research was needed, but little by little, Holmes did not insist too much there. The real movement has been liberated by Gideon Toury, who had just finished his PhD in 1976. He finished it in my garden, and he was there because there was a war in the Middle East, and he wanted to escape the war, and so on. So a small group of people, there are quite a few good things in the article by Pim that I'm going to quote, but there was only one general book that tried to distribute the results of that Leuven conference and several things around. It was only in 1985 that Theo Hermans published that small little book. The title is more famous than the text because not many people have read it. The Manipulation of Literature. It was entitled still Literature and Literary Translation. Now in 1976, we had refused to use that title, and we spoke not about literary translation, but about translated literature. And the conclusion of the first important conference was even that translated literature could not be solved neither by literature, neither by linguistics, but in interdisciplinary terms. There were important groups dealing with translation training in Europe. The linguists, and especially the Institute for Translation Training, you had them in Canada. The Canadians were not very active in our small little group, but they took part. But the Institute for Translation Training in Western Europe had quite a few people, and there was something like competition between translation training and the so-called, well, they did not know what kind of a title to give to us. So that group of 7 or 8 people, and even a few less after a few years. But in 1988, Mary Snell Hornby, who was the leading personality among the people from translation training, published a book at John Benjamin's, who did a lot later, and the book was entitled Translation Studies, an Integrated Approach. Translation Studies was borrowed from Holmes. It was the first time that the Holmes concept, so Holmes explains why he is going for such a title, but of course one could imagine many other titles. But Mary Snell Hornby and then the people for translation training joined something like a movement. And in 1992, the same Snell Hornby was the first president of the European Society for Translation Studies. And that's how this developed. But little by little, politics and other matters had their impact on the, I would say, on the distribution and the widening of the scope. But at least the number of people that took part, and after, so the number of people that took part were more and more impressive. And before 2000, in fact, translation studies was accepted on 5 continents. So this landscape changed. The kind of research worked out, there were different kinds, and the people coming from the so-called Holmes group especially around Turi. And I may mention that I always worked with Turi. And I edited that new journal from 89 and so on. And Turi was our first Cetra professor in 89. So little by little by little by little, but not many things. Well, there are many environments in translation studies on these 5 continents where the awareness of the beginning and the relativity of the various steps and the revolutions, which one of the innovations by Turi was the insistence on the so-called target system in translation matters. Well, in our journal, I published the first article on the internationalization of translation, which meant that source system, target system needed more components and that internationalization. So the so-called globalization was doing its work, but that's also part of confusion. Now, part of confusion, but on the other hand, communication improved all the time. So the channels used worldwide are more complex than before, but the monopolization of language and publication channels and the monopolization on behalf of the customers, the users, and the new scholars, say in Asia and so on, in China, but also in South Africa. These people in their basic bibliography make use of books available in English. Several among these books are translations from other languages, but it shows how, I would say, the distribution of English is co-responsible for some one-sidedness of research on translation. But one-sidedness in translation, is that bad? It's for a certain time and this changes. So I belong in the openness of the academic dynamics and in the openness, well, at least if there's no manipulation on behalf of political power and so on. So there were political conflicts. The conflict that, when was it? Around 2000, yeah? The conflict between Mona Baker, who of course has a special original background, and so has Turi, but Mona Baker refused on personal grounds access to her channels to people like Miriam Schlesinger, Turi, and so on. So this was an official political intervention and so on. But okay, here again, Pim did very important things. So Pim, as an Australian scholar, you know, he has Australian origin. He came to the United States, but he spent some time in the coal mines in South Africa as a simple worker. He studied in the big American universities in Paris, and now he's a professor at Tarragona, but also again in Australia. So the openness is one of the corrections of, I would say, confusion. Confusion and openness, well, these are delicate matters. But the word distribution has worked. I have recommendations about, I would say, orientations that individual centers and countries and groups can take in order to escape that kind of manipulation, I'll call it. But okay.
Okay, thank you. I think that you had already answered this question, but if you want to add something, okay, that's right. Next, in case of the history of our young discipline makes sense, we cannot exclude the necessity of historical components in our view on translation studies. Anthony Pym was not the first scholar who called the Holmes group the origins of translation studies. Would you believe that this first collective academic movement has been surviving until this very day? How, where, and would you not see any particular changes?
Okay. I already answered in one word, yes. But this answer requires some specification.
Okay.
Translation history, I was surprised. I know when I read for the first time the Holmes article, it was before our conference, 76, and I was surprised that he dealt with translation history and probably even with the history of translation studies, of research in translation. Translation studies, the name did not yet exist, but there was research and so on. Given their origins, many scholars dealing with translation say not only linguists, they also deal with historical situations in language. They can't avoid history. So my general answer about this historical question is, how can one avoid history? In any discipline, one deals with things that are available and they have been made available by culture and so on. So some research was going on and very systematically. The first research topic that we started in those years, Walter Costa was our student in Leuven. Our first topic was translation and literature in France in the first half of the 19th century. Obviously, the historical component was omnipresent, ubiquitous, and this was not the only one. And little by little, the methodological approaches were a bit successful. Of course, in the area where translation studies was developing, almost everyone was dealing with historical topics. And I remember the first articles by Pym on method in translation history. I recommend to read this. From the moment you deal with larger corpora, even in our contemporary society, you need historiographical concepts. And there are remarkable pages in these texts. There may be some debates and so on, but this is accepted in these publications by Pym, who played an important role. Well, only the positions of Pym and the relation with the new publications indicate that history and historiography are important. A student of mine, I mentioned certainly at least two other students besides Walter Costa. Tonight, one of my students, Lieven Dulst, just published together with several, he published 8 volumes in Australia about the history of translation in various historical circumstances. I would say this book could not even be conceived before the age of globalization. So it's clear that historiography can be very precise, and we also need that, but we need larger frameworks too. Okay?
All right. Professor Walter, could you please?
Yes, please. My question is, as a representative of the so-called origins of translation studies, you have played an active role in the institutionalization of the discipline. Would you distinguish components in the actual institutionalization that happen to bring in new components that were not really in view within the home story planning? Have you actually accepted them, and would you argue in favor of further revision or redefinition?
Thank you. Interesting question, but I would say that's already part of the history of the discipline. When entitling my paper here today, yesterday and tomorrow, it's clear that the future and the openness of translation studies are accepted as a must and not as a possibility. Well, anyway, that's my intention. But are there new components? One could say, are there components missing in the Holmes concepts? Of course, and quite a few. Is this a problem? No. How can you deal with articles that try to produce a state of the art that would run into the future and predict what is going to happen? But if there are any components that are new, I would even like to start by components that we developed. And of course, there are quite different developments, and there are very important developments that were, I would say, not to be imagined in 1972, nor in 1976, nor in 1988. And a paradox is, one of the first things that we tried to integrate into the discipline was the question of media. So it's very clear that media studies and the cultural component of media and media distribution, this was a new world, also among the people that were willing to deal with communication, like Holmes and the other. Media, first of all, I would say the kind of translation that is best known, that was best known, that still is nowadays, subtitling, dubbing, and so on. I have supervised a thesis by Martine Danon on the development of dubbing as part of the history of French business and French politics between the two world wars. And it has been published. So Martine Danon is recognized as one of the... Martine Danon is a French scholar who works in the States. The question of dubbing. The first article that tried to work out a model for the study of dubbing, and even not by coincidence, on the basis of the use of the idea of norms, the key creation of concepts in 1976 was Turi's concept of norms. The use of norms as a basis for subtitling was new. Who would ever have used this concept for dubbing? Now, a student of mine published the first article in Target on the question of norms in dubbing. by the way, to show how important this can be in many people's life, this gentleman happened to be the son of a good friend of mine. He's now one of the leading people in the Flemish media world. So media, my center CETRA would never have existed without the financial support of a given bank, a good bank. They were good since they were working for us also. CETRA, they were remarkable, and they made a contract for us for 6 years. Now, by definition, these people were interested in the question of translation because in their banking system, especially in that bank, there was a highly sophisticated awareness of translation issues. This book, I think I have shown it, International Business, Language in International Business. I started working with 2 students from social psychology and from economics. And we worked during 20 years on an article. Now, this article is still a classic for people who deal with economics and business and so on. Holmes does not talk about it. There are many other areas. One of the other areas that he does not talk about, and it's even refused by the lady who edited this volume, is the question of indirect translation. Indirect translation in business, in the European Union, in the United Nations, and so on. Indirect translation is one of the key components in the history of translation. What are the arguments for not assuming that it is part of the object of study? So I'm sure that there are quite a few other ones, other areas and sub-areas, and maybe areas that they have hardly imagined. But the multiplication of sub-discipline, so people start working out disciplines, but also sub-disciplines. And sub-disciplines may also paralyze the larger environment. So this is part of a general dynamics. But I would say the new components in the approaches recommended by Holmes. Holmes, after all, is a very kind and open-minded introduction to his new discipline. But there are areas that are, I would say, hardly taken into consideration, and that's normal. And the same applies to Turi. Turi was really selected by Holmes as his successor. It's very clear why Holmes went to Turi, and so on. But also Turi left out quite important areas in the translation studies phenomenon. It doesn't mean that he was unaware of it, but he knew, like most human beings, that one can't do everything. Okay, maybe you have questions about further such new components. At any moment, you can ask questions about this. But I'm listening to Adriane, who is running my ship.
Professor Walter, we will ask the next, okay? Question 6.
José, one of the hot topics in contemporary translation studies is the issue of the translator. One might refer to positions supported by Pym and Andrew Chesterman. And in discussions around it, the polysystemic approaches are supposed to have overlooked one of the crucial sociological components of translation phenomena. But the position of translators is also under threat from the moment technology gets involved even much more in AI than in machine translation. Such discussions demonstrate that how certain dilemmas from the 70s and 80s pop up again, partly under the impact of translation and culture. What do you think about it?
Thanks for the question. I like it very much, Walter. It's part of the things that we cannot exclude from the discussion. And I would say that there are misunderstandings. But one of the criticisms that Pim applies to even to Turi, but more to Ibn Zohar, is this question of the translator as a component of communication, as a key agent in communication. Now, to show that things are always complex and more complex than we guess, I can tell you the main responsibility for, I would say, for underestimating a little bit, I know why he did, and underestimating a little bit the question of the translator, the responsibility was mainly Turi, who after all worked out the most sophisticated model for research on translation. Now, the translator is not systematically ignored, but the insistence on general channels going from, say, a given source, a given environment, wants to have given texts at their disposal. The origins are more or less collective. So individual initiatives in translation exist, but they are very often connected with collectivities and ideas that given individuals discover among groups and so on. And this is very often the origin of translation initiatives. Now, Turi was probably during his life, which was unfortunately very short, he was one of the absolute top translators in Israel. He was better known as a translator than as a scholar in Israel. So what a paradox that Turi did not insist too much. I'm sure that one of the explanations is it's so obvious that translators play a role. But you refer to Chesterman, and I know that Chesterman has a little bit reacted in a similar way like you. Well, in fact, you did not insist too much, but it's clear that Chesterman was very familiar with the descriptive translation studies approaches and so on. And many among these people were so seduced by the idea that collectivities played such a role on the basis of their idea of norms and so on. So Chesterman reacted against that. Now, I was not too happy about this because if one thing is clear in the development of translation phenomena in culture nowadays, it's the growing standardization of the norm systems underlying translations, not only in language 1 and language 2, but worldwide. The whole question of world literature, I would say, influenced, heavily oriented by leading publishing houses and so on, of course, these people play a role in this. One of the scholars who has well seen this is José Cyriel in Paris, who is a student of Even Zohar's and of Bourdieu's. In fact, the sociological frameworks that have become active were a natural consequence of the attempts to discover general factors in society that oriented translation strategies. So I would say sociology, communication. I know I had some experiences with people from communication studies in my university, and very often also from sociology. They insist very heavily on the individual people. And when we worked, for instance, on subtitling and dubbing, very often they were really aggressive when seeing that we didn't start by asking translators why they did so and so and so. Now, it's clear that such questions are important, but many sociologists and communication experts reduced communication to the position of individuals. Now I come to machine translation and artificial intelligence. Machine translation already at the beginning, in the 1950s already, 1960s, was welcomed as one of the solutions to the translation problem, as if there were only one problem in methods of translation. Well, because they were interested in the production of translations. And the production of translations, the future of the people who were so enthusiastic about it, and the companies, matter of business. Even in Russia, they had machine translation, and they knew very well why they invested into it. So the use of machines as a technique for multiplying faster translations and communication, and for influencing communication, this power is a strong argument in favor of standardization. Now, I have never believed that machine translation was really, I would say, a machine against research on translation. I think that their categories, their patterns, their parameters were pragmatic and very often sufficient, but short-sighted. So machine translation, after all, why do we need artificial intelligence in view of translation? Because artificial intelligence probably works better than machine translation, as it was conceptualized at the beginning. Artificial intelligence. I was in a meeting 2 weeks ago where one of the people in the audience suddenly said it was on language, not on translation, but he used artificial intelligence. And he said, I have just read translations made by artificial intelligence. I was so impressed. People in the future will talk other languages. They will not need translation anymore and so on. Now, these are statements by people who are optimistic and who believe that the machine will solve communication on the basis of individual standardization, which is nonsense. One of the, I happened to look for new positions in business, and the number of requirements, the number of vagas, you say in Portuguese, the number of vagas available for intellectuals that will revise and correct artificial intelligence-based translations is impressive. The efficiency of artificial intelligence depends on more sophisticated parameters than in machine translation, because they take into consideration that the participation of the target audience is part of the game. And you need more sophisticated standardization. Now, it depends on the kind of audience you have, but after all, that's what we read in every page of Tourist. It's a matter of norms that rely people who produce text with the people who are going to use text. But by definition, there will always be conflicts between them. And that's why artificial intelligence has kept one important function from machine translation, that is post-editing. Without post-editing, artificial intelligence will not be able to produce text. We had a wonderful incident in our academic life in Belgium, because one of the rectors from one of the big universities produced a speech based on artificial intelligence, but she made, I don't know how many mistakes, and she was as ridiculous as possible. So the problem of artificial intelligence will depend on their respect of the idea of communication. And readers that do not like, say, a given subtitle, whether they know about translation or not, they will say this is a bad translation. So the power of the reception process, and that's what you read in Turi. That's his PhD thesis.
Professora Diana?
Yes, dear. We have time for a question from the audience.
Of course, we have time. I'm not running into the football World Cup.
Good one.
Notwithstanding the actors tonight. So who are the communicators? One of the communicators is, if I'm not mistaken, is from Latin America.
So, considering that we have Latin American, a very special Latin American country playing tonight, we have a question from a very special Latin American student from Poeti, Daniel Aguiar. He asks,
a very, very special student from Poet, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Our very own Prata da Casa. So he asks, in a hyper-connected world, how do shifting political ideologies, such as countries swinging from right-wing to left-wing, force the retranslation of classic texts to fit contemporary agendas?
I tried to translate this question into, say, well, as translators try to do, I tried to translate the question into, I would say, some of the principles and the concepts that I am using all the time, maybe too much. The question, of course, is very general. So how can translators play gymnastics between ideological traditions, especially when these ideological traditions are well represented in the communications that they have to produce, and especially, of course, when the source and the target system, I don't like the terminology, but you know what I mean. So when the source and the target system represent obviously a different ideology or whatever position, or say in business life, when they have very different priorities in matters of business. I don't see any fundamental difference. Well, of course, I'm sure sophisticated translators have their experience and they have their techniques. And the most successful among them will survive in this jungle of ideas. How many survive, I do not know too well. I remember what one of the people that we happen to contact, normally you can't contact them. So translation studies in that area is very risky and very sophisticated, very difficult. These people from intelligence service told that one of the recommendations they get from their masters, they have intelligent people who are not necessarily translators, but they are probably smart in communication. They tell them, of course, translators make selections. They are selective, if not eclectic. Now, in their selection of options and so on, which they have all the time, they are told, go for those options that have a chance to seduce your audience, your target system. So if you happen to know that they like a given terminology or given concept, make use of that. If it is really in the heart of the matter, when there are differences about, I would say, value systems or whatever, try to avoid to insist too much on that. So it's a way of seducing your target partner. But I don't think this is fundamentally different from what translators are doing. Maybe in literature it's different, but and so on. But I think it's an important principle. But when you check, when you test in precise situations, you can see that this happens to be the case. In my country, in Flanders, my colleagues have done very important work, historical. They made the historical analysis of the theoretical, the commentary produced by the people from Parliament that were surrounding the translators of the Constitution. You know, the Constitution in Dutch was one of the wars between Belgium, as such, and the Flemish on the other hand, because the Flemish were requiring a constitution. They did not have it. And only at the beginning of the 20th century, it was more or less complete. It still requires revision and so on. That's normal. But in such situations, the Flemish intellectuals who were part of the commissions, the national ones, in commissions with Francophones. They had to convince their Francophone colleagues, and these were politicians among each other. Now, the analysis of their discourse shows that these Flemish intellectuals supporting fundamentally and ideologically the new text of the Constitution, that they were so much accustomed to something like a flattery discourse towards the Francophone power. And they were so proud to be good in French that they were a little bit too much submitted to the options suggested by, I would say, les forces établies, the established forces. So it's all a matter of diplomatic life and games. And this is more the case. So the more a given text is public and institutionalized, the more this is the case. Now, this is, I would say, this is almost trivial, but what has not been studied, and that's the real reason why translation studies is important, what has hardly been studied on the basis of translation phenomena is the impact that the orientation of translations has in so many different functions in society, from top to bottom. Well,
Thank you so much, Professor Lambert. We asked a complex question and we got a very, very rich answer as always. I would like to unfortunately announce the end of our discussion because we are running out of time. And I would like to thank everybody for taking part in this project and supporting us during this semester. We had Professor Lambert and 7 other fantastic researchers who contributed to this Ciclo de Palestras that in the end formed like a mini translation studies course. And I strongly suggest that you guys who are watching us after the transmission or are watching us live during the transmission, revisit if you have not yet visited those are the 7 presentations and the many other presentations that came before, because this is not our first rodeo and we have a lot of excellent speakers in our list, in our lineup. So putting all of them together is a huge amount of fantastic knowledge on our field that we love so much and that we are here to celebrate. And the only reason I am taking the time talking about that is that today is our final live for the semester. And it's not fair that I am given the task of saying basically goodbye to the Ciclo de Palestras 2026.1, because it was not me who did it. It was Ellen Barreto, Michele Gomes, Adriane Moura, Walter Costa, José Lambert, and the 7 other presenters that were here as a team, working together voluntarily at Friday nights to bring you this knowledge and give you an opportunity to look a little bit further into the intricacies and richness of translation studies, which is our love, our passion, and for many of us, our lives. So thank you all, and I'll as we begin, we are going to finish in the competent hands of Ellen Barreto and Montiel. Good night, everybody. And enjoy the video for those who are not watching us live. Enjoy the video and enjoy the previous lives. You're gonna see it's not a waste of time. Ellen?
Obrigada, professora Diana, retomando aqui o português e continuando a fala da professora Diana, né? Infelizmente, estamos nos aproximando do final dessa edição tão especial do Ciclo de Eventos LETRARE 2026.1. E, mais uma vez, em nome do LETRARE, em nome da Poet na UFC, nós gostaríamos de agradecer imensamente a presença do professor Lambert, tanto pelo horário que ele está se dispondo, né, quanto pela generosidade em compartilhar conosco a trajetória e as reflexões sobre os estudos da tradução, que para a gente, que é estudioso da área, é tão precioso, né? Eu tenho certeza que todo mundo que está aqui tendo a oportunidade de participar desse momento está bebendo dessa fonte, né? Porque esse é o nosso sentimento. Nós agradecemos também à doutoranda Adriane Moura pela iniciativa e pela condução da entrevista, ao professor Dr. Walter Costa e à professora doutora Diana Fortier por comporem essa mesa e também enriquecerem esse diálogo. Encerramos hoje não apenas essa transmissão, mas também mais uma edição do Ciclo de Eventos. Ao longo desse semestre, a gente teve a alegria de construir um espaço aqui de troca, de aprendizagem, de divulgação científica, reafirmando o papel dos estudos da tradução como campo vivo, plural e interdisciplinar, somando ao que o professor Lambert traz nesse diálogo, né? Os estudos da tradução são um campo vivo, né, interdisciplinar. E antes de nós encerrarmos, lembro a vocês de preencherem o formulário de presença que está disponível no chat para fins de emissão de certificado. Convidamos também você a nos seguir nas nossas redes sociais, @Projeto Letrare no Instagram, e se inscrever também no nosso canal no YouTube para acompanhar as nossas próximas atividades do projeto. E não se esqueçam, nossa programação de 2026.2 já está sendo montada, então aguardem a divulgação, que muito em breve novos nomes estarão conosco aí no segundo semestre do nosso ciclo de eventos. Muito obrigada pela presença de todos e até a próxima.
May I reply?